Alright, a quick little overview of my inav 2.6 plane. It is a FliteTest FT Arrow. It's the one's made out of foam board and hot glue. I 3D printed this center pod so I have room for my Matek F405 Mini, and I can mount the ESC on top. I have a little Tramp VTX. I mounted it right here, that way it would get plenty of cooling. I have a Phoenix 2 camera, the Joshua Bardwell edition. Works really well. And a couple of digital servos. This is a little, I don't know, like a little NFC pad so I can change the frequency with my phone. That was before I figured out I could change the frequency of my VTX with one of the UARTs on my flight control. Another thing I did is I added a beeper to my flight controller so that when I load my mission that I made from Mission Planner, I can tell that it took. So to do that by the sticks, you take the right stick and move it up to the top right, and then those two beeps means that it took. So let's see how the mission goes.
Satellites, heading 0, range 0, bearing 256, elevation -3, 0 minute. 10 satellites. Heading 166, range 180, bearing 340, elevation 137. Voltage 11.6, 10 satellites. 9 satellites. Heading 93, range 357, bearing 257, starting mission, elevation 131, voltage 11.5, 9 satellites. 10 satellites. Heading 44, range 547, bearing 311, elevation 144, voltage 11.5, 1 minute, 10 satellites. 9 satellites. Heading 325, range 475, bearing 255, elevation 134. Voltage 11.4, 9 satellites. 10 satellites. Heading 152, range 239, bearing 248, elevation 131, voltage 11.4, 9 satellites, 10 satellites. Heading 126, range 554, bearing 309, elevation 137, voltage 11.3, 10 satellites, 2 minutes, 9 satellites. 10 satellites, heading 323, range 465, bearing 255, elevation 131. Voltage 11.2, 9 satellites, 10 satellites. Heading 216, range 242, bearing 230, elevation 141, voltage 11.2, 10 satellites. 9 satellites. Heading 219, range 436, bearing 315, elevation 147, voltage 11.2, 11 satellites, 3 minutes. 12 satellites. Heading 304, range 511, bearing 271, elevation 121. Voltage 11 satellites. 12 satellites. Heading 207, range 265, bearing 230, elevation 134, voltage 11, 12 satellites. 11 satellites. Heading 178, range 177, bearing 294, elevation 144. Voltage 11, 12 satellites, 11 satellites, 4 minutes. 12 satellites. Heading 107, range 554, bearing 310, elevation 144. Voltage 10.9, 11 satellites. 10 satellites. Heading 332, range 521, bearing 263, elevation 124. Voltage 10.8, 13 satellites. 11 satellites. Heading 130, range 282, bearing 246, elevation 124. Voltage 10.8, 12 satellites, 13 satellites. 5 minutes. Heading 132, range 229, bearing 276, elevation 124. Voltage 10.8, 13 satellites. 12 satellites. Heading 85, range 465, bearing 316, elevation 157. Voltage 10.8, 13 satellites. 12 satellites. Heading 321, range 449, bearing 265, elevation 127. Voltage 10.6, 12 satellites. 13 satellites. 6 minutes. Heading 143, range 282, bearing 240, elevation 124. Voltage 10.6, 13 satellites. Heading 148, range 209, bearing 288, elevation 141. Voltage 10.7, 13 satellites, 12 satellites. 13 satellites. Heading 75, range 508, bearing 311, elevation 137. Voltage 10.6, 12 satellites. 13 satellites. Angle pilot has control. Heading 319, range 446, bearing 264, elevation 52. Voltage 10.5, 13 satellites, 7 minutes, 12 satellites. 13 satellites. Heading 203, range 29, bearing 316, elevation -6. Voltage 11.2, 12 satellites, 14 satellites.